Dan, how are we doing today?
I'm doing well, John. How are you?
I'm doing great. And this is kind of a special episode of the show. Steph, Savannah, they're on the road right now at FinOps X down in San Diego, along with a bunch of other team members. So Dan and I are going to be taking over the stream with a special coast to coast episode. I'm here out in San Francisco, and we've got Dan over in Brooklyn right now. So very excited to have you here, Dan, and have you live on Twitch.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, excited. My first time on the show. Long time coming. So happy to be here.
Yeah, it is a long time coming. Dan's, been on the team now for how long have you been here? Just over a year?
9 months, a year, 9 months.
Well, Dan was on the customer side too for a long time, and it helped us with a lot of other events. So just it feels like it's been, I think, a lot longer than that. Um, but yeah, so for everyone here that's joining us, welcome to the Keys to AWS Optimization. This is the show where we share stories, concepts, solutions to help you unlock your spend at AWS. My name is John Massey. I'm a principal optimization solutions architect here at AWS. And as I mentioned, we're joined here by one of my peers, Daniel Eisenberg, on the optics team. And Dan, I don't know if we want to just kind of jump right into it. If you want to give, the 1 minute origin story, a little bit of background on yourself and kind of how you got here.
Yeah, sure. Happy to do so. So been at AWS for 9 months, and prior to that, I was at Capital One for my entire career. So 12 years at Capital One. Started off in their college hire program. I came in doing VMware operations in our data center. That transitioned to system integration, so kind of getting CPU memory, database storage, and stuff in the data center itself for applications across the company. And then Cap One said, "Hey, we're going all in on AWS. We're getting rid of our data centers. We had to become experts in cloud migrations and kind of cloud SRE type work." During that time, was doing a lot of optimization type work. It was just something I was really passionate about. I then took a brief stint working with two startups that Capital One built, which is now Capital One Shopping. I was kind of helping them go from being a siloed fintech startup to them being owned by a super large financial company. So that comes all the regulations into how you do things. You can't just log into prod and make changes. It's very regulated. And then from there, moved over to what became the FinOps team. Was there for 5 years. Helped kind of build what I called a FinOps strategy and adoption team. So grew that from just me to a team of 5 or 6 people, working across the enterprise, doing everything and all things FinOps related, like optimizations, automation, RISPs on the tech side. Because Capital One had a finance kind of cloud team as well, which is one of our other associates, Jeff Dureski, came from. And then, yeah, came here to AWS. I'm a senior optimization solution architect supporting our customers, our strategic customers in financial services. So happy to be
Cool.
here.
Yeah, and Dan, I think one of the things that I've always learned a lot from you when you're kind of talking through how to drive optimizations is having that tech background and seeing not only kind of how things get designed from technical perspective, but your experience going from being all first party data center to all cloud. How did that look? How is that different? And we're going to be talking today about inflection points around the FinOps journey and different stages of FinOps maturity. And I think your perspective on that's been really cool because you all did a lot, from an automation and a governance perspective, but have kind of seen it from a bunch of different angles. So very excited to kind of dig into that today and talk more about, FinOps maturity and the inflection points.
Yeah, I think, John, the other thing to call out was you were our optics resource when I was at Capital One.
Yes.
Was a fun kind of relationship that we had prior to kind of me joining the team. You were always a great resource for us, and I try to strive to be as good of a optics resource to the accounts that I'm working on.
Well, I appreciate that, Dan. You didn't have to say that, but I appreciate it. And yeah, I think that's the cool part too, is that, from this role, the optics team, we get to learn a lot and partner really closely with our customers, kind of find out, hey, what's working for folks. And what kind of makes each one of our customers unique, right? Because the FinOps journey is going to look very different for everybody. Are you one of those customers who has a lot of regulatory concerns like you were talking about? Are you someone who is all cloud native, building a startup, doing those things? It's going to look different for everyone. I was going to say before we jump into that, kind of a couple questions, just to kind of kick things off. I always try to remember, some of Steph's, special kind of parts of the show. I'm curious, Dan, are you having a frugal week this week or a not so frugal week? And I'm curious, folks in the chat too. Is it anybody else? What's your week looking like?
Yeah, so I would say it's been pretty frugal. I did pay rent a few days ago, so that was probably the big expense for the month. But outside of that, just nothing too big. No new watches or anything like that for me. How about you, John?
I think it's been, maybe moderately frugal, traveling to San Francisco, I'm out here just for a couple of days. You always end up, maybe getting a couple surprises along the way. But yeah, overall, moderately frugal, trying our best, while we travel. But cool. So should we just jump right into it, Dan? I mean, we'll start off kind of with the first part, around maturity stages. And another question kind of for the audience, where do you all kind of feel like you are today from a maturity perspective? We're going to talk about it from kind of a crawl, walk, run, and then what's beyond that. But for folks who are joining us on the stream, where do you all kind of feel like you are today? And Dan, do you want to give some of your perspective on like what those stages look like? And let us know in the chat as we're going through this, like, do you agree? Did it look different for you? As you look at, where you are from a maturity stage.
Yeah, happy to kind of go through like my idea and kind of some personal experience from the different stages themselves, John. So obviously we start off with the crawl stage, and to me that means like you're doing some basic cost visibility and reporting. You have some dashboards, whether they're enterprise wide or kind of manually built at the beginning. You at least have that set up. Um, from an optimization perspective, usually kind of manual effort, like one time optimization efforts, um, limited automation if there is any. And I think one of the things Capital One like worked really well for us was when we first moved to the cloud, we kind of had this cloud custodian tool to help kind of automate a lot of things. And it wasn't built for anything FinOps related to start. It was built for security purposes, but we were able to kind of layer in tagging principles, which is like one of the key components of FinOps on the early set, like onset of our cloud journey. So that really helped kind of at least drive the beginning stages. And then when we started walking, right, more proactive optimization efforts, kind of looking to see where do we have some opportunity to work on. We were then able to build in some guardrails, some automation to say, hey, where can we clean up some waste that's out there, and then start building out our FinOps practice as a whole. So going from kind of maybe a like a finance led to a kind of team of both finance and engineering working together across the board. And then let's say the run stage, the final stage, maybe, you really have a lot of automation, a lot of governance, a lot of things in place that are tied back to hopefully standards that you may have. So like a retention period, you have a data standard. Is that tied to that? Is that happening on an automated fashion? Deep technical understanding and optimizations from a code perspective. Like, are you choosing the right code and libraries for your applications, the right architecture, whether it's serverless, or Lambda, or Aurora SQL, right? Are you picking the right thing for the right application that you're building? And then just like a ton of integrations throughout the whole pipeline, right? Are people able to deploy things that they shouldn't be? Like, is the pipeline stopping them? Do they have visibility? Is that visibility automated? Is it sending them Slack messages? Is it sending them emails? Is it getting in front of them so they at least like have the full understanding of kind of what's happening? So that's kind of my high level, kind of different stages in maturity.
So, and I'm curious, Dan, too, like when you think about some of those patterns, things like automation, um, you know, I, I I think about the stages of maturity also having something to do with like pervasiveness of those actions, like across the organization, where maybe early on, the automation is just happening with like one team. One team is kind of owning and doing that. As they mature, that is becoming more of like an org wide motion. Some of those like really positive patterns are starting to become, more of like a governance pattern for the org. I'm just curious, where do you kind of see those things starting to grow? Is that, kind of somewhere in the middle? Do you think that happens later on, with the maturity phases?
Yeah, I think it's something that starts early on. A bunch of the, at least in my experience at Capital One, we had each of the different like lines of businesses or BUs within Capital One kind of like owning and maintaining their own automation and governance policies within custodian themselves when it was related to FinOps. Security was centralized across the enterprise because it was tied back to specific standards we had. But at the time, we didn't have FinOps related standards at Capital One. So kind of it was up to the line of business to say, hey, like what's your feeling about deleting unused EBS snapshots after X time frame? And it was up to them to build that out. Over time, and when we started growing our FinOps team and having more engineers, we actually centralized all of those policies into one repo that would then kind of get implemented across the enterprise as a whole. It's not an easy thing to do. It definitely takes a lot of communication, I would say, because you need to make sure like the whole company is okay with the thing that you're doing, specifically if you have a delete or a change within that policy itself. But that was definitely something on the more mature in the run stage it takes to kind of have that automation at scale.
Cool. And I'm curious too, some of these patterns that are happening with FinOps and like, cost efficiency and maturity at the customer level. Do you think that those are happening kind of in line with other governance motions? I'm curious, with your experience at Capital One, or maybe what you've seen with other customers. Does the FinOps behavior kind of lag behind that? Does it happen in lockstep? Is it, something that is happening in advance of other governance? Like, because I'm curious, like sometimes you might be able to look at other things that are happening and say, hey, is this a good indication that, we're going to have a really uphill battle for implementing cost governance, or are we maybe already further along than we think because of other things that we're doing?
Yeah, I think in my experience, it lags behind for sure. Um, Within Capital One, like when we first moved to the cloud, everything was security focused, right? And we wanted to make sure we had the most secure cloud we could. Cost really wasn't one of the biggest things to consider at the time. Um, but the more and more that we got more comfortable, our governance tooling around our security footprint was more mature. We were then able to tie in to these security tools that we already had built and say, all right, well, we're doing these 10 security things. Everyone, it's already built in. Everyone knows what to do. How can we then start integrating some of these efficient architecture decisions and cost standards, if you want to call them that, into our pipeline? And then I think the other thing from a maturity, John, is looking at these enterprise-wide security initiatives or resiliency initiatives that the companies are doing, and then questioning them from a cost perspective and saying, hey, like we want to be resilient and we totally understand resiliency is a key function here. But is there what's the cost to resiliency? Can you be over resilient for the application you're building? And having those, I think, conversations was something that took us a while to have because it was so focused on just like being resilient, right? Like we were a bank on the cloud, like we had to be resilient. But then kind of over time, we were able to say, all right, well, like what's the cost of this? Is there different tiers for it? Like what's the cost benefit? Like what are the RTO RPOs and how does that align to the cost of these applications? But yeah, definitely something that took a while to get to.
I mean, do you think that customers are able to ask those questions, early on in their maturity journey, or do you think that that requires you to kind of be a little bit further along in order to even say, hey, do some of these, resiliency or security standards? We're looking at these from the right cost angle.
I would hope everyone's always asking them if they're at the table. I think getting to the table of when these initiatives and these security policies and governance standards are being built is the hardest part. Because a lot of the time they're not going to bring in the FinOps team when they're coming up with a large scale tech initiative related to security or resiliency. But over time, the more that you're able to kind of like show the benefit of the FinOps principles that you've been kind of teaching at the company, as you may say, um, they'll be more inclined to invite you to those conversations so that you can weigh in on the cost of this new thing. And like just being at the table for like any new initiative, whether it's like a security initiative or just something like any sort of tech related initiative that the company is rolling out for their strategy, like being at that table is super important, but takes a while to get to.
Yeah, and that's kind of that part around building out, all the partnerships and all the cross-functional stuff. and maybe some of those things are happening from a FinOps, perspective, but you're not calling it that, just yet. Somebody else is looking at it from that angle, but it's not really part of your FinOps bucket. Um, I'm curious too, if there are any misconceptions that you kind of have noticed around FinOps maturity, where you know people have talked about it from one perspective, but you've either had a different experience or you just kind of have a different take on it.
Yeah, I think like you can't always be in front of every single like cloud initiative. I think like that is something that is maybe a misconception that you're like, oh yeah, before anything gets built in the cloud, like we're gonna have a say in it. Um, and I think like it takes a while to. I don't know if you can ever get to that point because there's so many people and so many teams that are building things, but as long as you can kind of provide them with some guidelines as to like what are some considerations you could be thinking of, um, that'll at least like help kind of forge that path.
Yeah, I think another one that I think about, and you started to touch on it with like the automation pieces and where that takes place, is just like what does that automation look like, right? Is it corrective change? Like I think a lot of people can quickly think about automation as being something that's taking recommendations and immediately implementing them. That's kind of
Yeah.
like a dream state, something that would be ideal, perfect world. There's a lot of caveats that come with it, but maybe automation is just around reporting early on, or maybe it's just around automating some of the tagging. And I'm curious if you had anything to share kind of on what that automation journey looked like for you all. What did it start with, and then what did it end up like kind of evolving into?
Yeah, it definitely started at just like communication, just emails. And I think like most of the engineers at Capital One can probably agree with me on this one. Like we all had a folder that was the custodian folder. So whenever the tool sent you an email, like it went to the folder. It didn't go to your main inbox. So there's thousands and thousands of times that the tool was sending you an email. And that can kind of be like too much. But at least you're kind of communicating it. And whether it's through that the tool itself or through if you have like a CCOE or some sort of monthly meeting, that you can at least get it in front of people. But from like the communication, it then gets into the actionable insights, which usually you need to over communicate even that piece of like we're going to do something or like you're doing something that we don't think you should be doing or that there's a better path forward. And then it gets into, hey, I think we're going to make this change. We're not going to make the change for a month, right? You have a month to make to fix it or put in a tag that'll stop it from happening, and then go from there to the actually making a change into the resource itself. But like there's also other types of communication, John, outside of just like directly emailing someone through automation. Like you can send them a GitHub PR, right? Like something that, hey, they don't have to take it, but it's there for them. They have the visibility into it. It'll automatically update their code. They won't have to like touch what's in the cloud today. But in their next deployment, if they accept that code, it'll then fix it from there on. Um, so yeah, I think there's a lot of different areas to kind of communicate when it comes to like the automation and like the advancements that we have.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about another one too that we had talked about a long time ago, which was around some of the stuff that was happening with you all when we first started working together, where you guys had some distinguished engineers or master engineers that were kind of domain experts in certain areas, and that kind of helped dive deeper into either service scopes or individual workloads, and help to establish some of the best practices around optimization and what that looked like, and turn those things into automation where applicable. I'm just curious, like if there's anything you kind of share around that, and like being able to sort of foster this like deep expertise in certain optimization areas, and when folks should start to do that, and what that might look like as it evolves.
Yeah, I think anytime that you're gonna recommend something to an engineering team or to anyone, really, like you should be able to back that up and understand fully like why you're recommending that and understand the data behind it. So if you're saying, hey, I want you to use S3 intelligent tiering, fully understanding how S3 intelligent tiering works, why it's the right solution, the pros of it, also the cons of it, and then how can you then work from just me recommending it to me building it into automation once we've gotten enough people on board. And John, that was something that I think we worked together on when we implemented intelligent tiering on our data lake as our kind of first foray into intelligent tiering. And then we were able to scale that out to an enterprise wide standard that's saying, hey, any new bucket that gets created, if it doesn't already have a lifecycle policy that's pushing data to deep archive or deleting objects within X number of days, all right, we're going to move that to intelligent tiering because at scale, it is a more efficient option.
Yeah, that, I mean, that drives more action too when it's very prescriptive guidance and it's helping to do more of like root cause analysis, more hand holding, more support on like actually taking the action versus just providing a recommendation.
I would touch on too on that one, like we spent a lot of time with Christy Lee from the database or the storage team asking millions of questions about S3, how intelligent tiering works, anything that could go wrong, everything that could go wrong, every use case that you can think of before we were able to kind of come up with our solution and implement it. Because like we had to be sure, right? If you're doing this at scale, you have to be sure that you're doing the right thing. Um, like loved Christy. She was great. Probably was annoyed with all of her questions after the 10th meeting on intelligent tiering, but we were able to kind of get to that result.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that says a lot about how exhausted you need to be in order to implement these things at scale too, and maybe that is one of the inflection points as we kind of like go to this next section of the conversation around inflection points between maturity stages when you go from just being in that like kind of crawl phase where you want to do these things, but for some reason they're not happening. Maybe one of the reasons they're not, actually coming to life is because you're not able to go deep enough. Maybe you don't have, the internal expertise or even, a person who's maybe like a dotted line. It could be a resource, from AWS, a partner who's able to help you, answer those 100 questions that you might have that kind of block you from taking action or, you know, give more confidence for someone to actually implement the recommendations. So I'm curious, as we start to like talk about those inflection points, if there's anything else that sort of comes to mind for you as like you're going from the crawl phase to the walk phase, like what do you think is sort of a tipping point that's starting to happen there? And what could that look like?
Yeah, I think one of the tipping points there could just be from like having one-off optimizations or one-off problems to how do you solve this at scale for the entire company? And it could still be like a script or like a one-time change that solves it for that specific time period, but you did it at scale across multiple accounts. But then like the next thought is, all right, well, like how do I stop this from ever happening? If I don't want anyone at the company to use GP3, can I update my CI/CD pipeline or my build template so that it's not using that ever, or it doesn't allow that within the pipeline itself? Do I have automation in place to automatically change it if someone does build it that way? So I think it's going from like seeing a problem, making one change, making a change at scale, and then making sure that thing cannot happen again if that's kind of the route you're going with your specific optimization.
Yeah, you said something before around becoming experts in order to actually like sell someone on making the change. And in order to really have that super deep expertise, you kind of have to like pick a problem. And in order to be able to go really, really deep on it. And that stuck out to me as one of those inflection points. Like, have you identified a specific problem that you're going to go really deep on in order to sell it better? And then in order to also start building out the guardrails, the automation, it's just it's not realistic to think that you can do that across a really, really wide breadth all at once. But, proving it out with one specific, more narrow focus,
Yeah.
you start to like, unpack all of those details on it.
Yeah, definitely.
And I'm thinking about a few of the other inflection points and kind of how you all approach that. Not sure if you want to share more detail on it, Dan, but like I thought one thing that was cool, with that S3 example that you were sharing was that that did start to open up opportunities for automation, right? So it was being able to go back and say, okay, now we have all the details and all the patterns on this. We're going to look into what we could potentially automate. You shared, a bit before on this around being able to evaluate things like life cycle policies. Do those exist on buckets? How do we qualify it? Would you be able to share a little bit more detail on that?
Yeah, and I think like if you take that one, John, like going back to the core problem statement of we have too much data in standard and we don't know if that's good or bad, right? So within using intelligent tiering, if data is in that top tier, we consider that good use, right? Even though it's more expensive, you're using the S3 as it should be. But we are paying a small monitoring fee. So over time, we were like, well, most of the company is using standard. We know that intelligent sharing is this new solution. How do we make sure that we're covering our bases so that if someone already has good lifecycle policies set up, we're not going to overwrite them, right? We don't want to stop people from using lifecycle policies correctly or using S3 in a way that is right for their application. So that was how we kind of built our policy within custodian for S3 was what are the things we need to check for to say, hey, you're doing it correctly. And then if you're not doing these things that we consider like good S3 usage, we're then going to apply intelligent tiering to you automatically and kind of see the benefits from there. So we did have buckets that had really good lifecycle policies. We're deleting objects after 30 days or after 40 days. Like you don't want to move your objects to intelligent tiering at that point because the cost benefit's not there. So just making sure you're kind of going through the all of the checks that could be possible, and then kind of making sure your implementation validates kind of those things on the back end.
And I have a question for the audience here too. Have any of you run into a blocker, in your, FinOps journey or kind of in your FinOps goals? And have you looked at that as kind of being, an inflection point that's driven you to do something else? One of the ones I think we start to see a little bit is around enablement, where folks can do the first stuff that you talked about, Dan, which is, cost visibility, reporting. They know the opportunities that are out there, but why are we not taking action on this? Why is something not happening? And that can be, this need for deeper expertise, like you talked about. And that could be something that happens within the FinOps team, or it could also be broader enablement. Do the actual hands-on practitioners have all the resources um, that they need in order to be able to implement the changes? I'm curious if you have any thoughts on like what some of those blockers are, where if a customer is starting to see something, is that a chance for them to start to like, dive a little bit deeper into maybe their goals or how they're doing things? Maybe they need more people on the team in order to be able to do it. Any of those blockers stand out for you?
Yeah, I think there could be a few in there, John. One is like the limit to like manual efforts on your team itself and like the amount of engineering hours or engineering power you may have. Um, let's say you want to work with the top 10 applications on your team, but you're a two-person FinOps team. You're already doing RIs, SPs. You're still managing a tagging strategy. You're owning your visualization dashboards. Do you have the time to start working with all of these other applications? And that's not even considering like maybe the BU level type optimization opportunities. So I think like just number of like hours of engineering time or like FinOps team members like will limit you to the amount that you can do and the scale that you can reach. Again, all dependent on the scale of the company and like the applications that you may have. Um, and then I think the other one is like maybe you just need some more technical skill set. And I think this was like an inflection point at Capital One was we started hiring these like individual contributors at a very senior level that really were technical and were able to kind of dive deep into these libraries and the tooling and whatever it may be at a level that some of us and myself included, like we didn't know, right? But they were able to bring so much knowledge with them that when we were having conversations with whether it was a vendor or if it was just a large application of the company, they were able to kind of push back on some of the key principles that they thought they knew about with kind of like real data to back up the kind of solution that we were proposing. And I kind of think the last blocker to me, which is it was a one that happened all the time, was like vendor products saying we couldn't do things. This was like a classic example of like we wanted to do something, everyone else was doing it. This vendor says we couldn't do it. And it happened with intelligent tiering. We had like 90 something percent of the company on intelligent tiering. There was one application that had a lot of S3 usage that the vendor said we couldn't use. After a few months, we decided to sit down with the vendor to say, hey, like what's the problem with intelligent tiering? We're using it at scale with lots of petabytes of data. Like, why wouldn't your application work with that? And they really didn't have an answer. They weren't familiar enough with intelligent tiering. They didn't understand how it would work. They thought it was like cold storage and they would have to retrieve objects and all of these things. So we were able to kind of teach this vendor about like why intelligent tiering was the right thing to use. And then they were able to kind of say, hey, we do approve this usage. We can then allow you to use this like in your own cloud. So vendors are always a little bit tricky to work with at times.
Well, yeah, and you're going off label a little bit there too, right? Where you're like, "Hey, we're gonna try something. We feel strong, we feel confident about it. Maybe
Yeah.
you have more experience than them, or it just hasn't been a priority, for them
Yeah.
to dive super deep into that area." Um, that's a cool one. I think that's like a unique blocker to run into where, your velocity and your maturity is like, starting to outpace like the partners that you're working with, in some
Yeah.
area. You're actually helping to evolve them. That's very cool. I'm curious about like some of the stuff too around growing the FinOps team and doing that 2 ways, like adding headcount and then also just incubating like new skills. I guess if you had to like, put on your hat where you're, leading a FinOps team and you're starting to find yourself run into blockers where you can't do things for tech reasons, how would you overcome that? Would you be incubating new skills? Would you, be trying to hire new people that are domain experts? Like, I'm just curious, like, how would you approach that?
Yeah, again, like I lived it in a way. We grew like the FinOps strategy and adoption team that I managed, going from just kind of me and Jersey at the time, my boss, to like an eight person group. And the way that I was hiring, like I was looking for very, very technical focused engineers. If that was the problem we were solving for, let's say we wanted to build automation or we wanted to build anomaly detection, we wanted to sit down with an application team, fully understand their architecture and how they're using things, and then be able to recommend and prove through data why our recommendation is true. So I hired a bunch of strong software data engineers, but that wasn't the only people I hired on the team. Like we also brought in some program managers because we wanted to scale our kind of visibility and the culture side of FinOps. So again, I think it depends on the problem you're solving for, but like, I wasn't really looking for people that had too much FinOps experience. I was looking for people with like really, really strong technical experience. And then we can kind of teach them the cost side of things, but if they already can bring their understanding of data pipelines and data engineering and marrying data together, that was what I was personally looking for when I was growing like the team itself.
Got it. I see a comment in the chat here around getting into EKS and RDS extended support on a critical system. Being able to build out, new skills in areas where maybe it's become like a quick priority for you. How would you pick those areas to dive deep in? And I think, I'm kind of calling that comment out specifically because sometimes we see customers who all of a sudden, hey, there's a, we see this as an opportunity to, modernize and do this stuff. We know it's going to save us a bunch of money. We want to, get some of those skill sets on the team in order to help us do that because we're not going to be able to do it ourselves. Would you look at, incubating the skills based on, like emerging, areas that are of interest for the company? Would you do it based on most dollar value savings that's kind of already on your list of things to go after? Mix of all of it, kind of how do you prioritize that?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of a mix. Like I think having like a deep like system architecture and like cloud architecture understanding is super important. But if you have that, but you're unable to kind of do the data side of it and understand like how to marry multiple different kind of data sets together to kind of back up your analysis, then it's going to be a little bit hard to kind of get buy-in from our end users or application teams or like the hands-on keyboard developers that are building that application that you're saying, hey, we'd like you to do something else for. So kind of being able to kind of marry the data together, all but also be able to speak to the architecture of it and why the thing you're recommending is helpful. I think communication is a big one too, John. Like you have to be able to kind of speak to and prove your point in a way. So having like a really good communication skill set is something that maybe is less talked about, but something that I think is super important when you're hiring, being because like they have to sell. FinOps in a way is a sales team, right? You have to sell cost optimization to your own company, which sounds a little bit backwards because you think your company would want to save money, but they want to build features, they want to build products. So you have to kind of sell your priority with them.
I'm curious, do you think you could teach that? And is there a way to, help people kind of, learn how to do that better? Um,
I mean, I think you could teach most things. I think it just comes with time. So if you have a problem statement you're trying to solve for today, kind of hiring someone and then having to teach them in 6 months something is going to be a little bit harder. I think it depends on maybe the level you're hiring for. If you're hiring for like an entry level engineer versus someone more senior, I think if you're hiring someone more senior, you really want them to kind of bring their experience and skill sets. So I think like the leveling matters a little bit on that one.
I think the other part, I think about is something you mentioned earlier around, like, cross-functional partnerships and stuff too, and maybe you can spot those opportunities where, like, 2 personalities mesh really well and, they're able to kinda complement each other and be the ones who can help, overcome a certain gap, get someone from the FinOps team who maybe is, more technical and they have good rapport with someone on a big app team, can kind of partner up together, sort of ride shotgun and, help to sort of like drive an outcome, instead
Yeah.
of just forth it broadly. And that's like culture too. I'm curious if you have any like creative ways of driving those sort of like partnerships across the organization. Anything that sort of like stuck out to you from things you've seen with your customers or just your own experiences?
Yeah, I think there's 2. I think one is having the right people. So at a company at the scale of Capital One, like for almost every service within AWS, like we had a SME aligned to it that kind of would own the enablement of that service at scale. So if you have an optimization play and it's for a specific service, there's someone on the cloud engineering team that kind of owns the enablement and the usage of it. What again, when I say usage, it's like the usage of it at the company versus like an application team using it itself. So understanding who those people are and what they're advocating for and how you can get them to either be on your side or like kind of prove to them why you think this change should happen with that service itself is very key. I'm trying to remember the second one, John. I can't remember the second one at the moment, so I'm just gonna go with that one.
That's a good one. I like it. I was thinking about another inflection point too. So Dan did a really cool Pure Connect event a couple years back, sharing some of the journey that you all had gone on, and you mentioned something in that around like building tools and building things internally. And I think there had been a comment around like getting started early on with building to solve for your own problem sets was something that you all said kind of wish you did earlier or something you recommend folks start early, like being able to solve for your own specific problem sets. And I think that's an inflection point that we see pretty often too, where, kind of just using tools either the way they are or not closely aligned enough to maybe your own specific problem sets just isn't getting enough traction, right? And the tools aren't iterating, they're not able to take into account like feedback from end users that are saying, "Hey, it'd be nice if it like did this instead," or "You're not showing me like this specific detail that I really need to be able to see." So I'm just wondering what your take is on like builder skill sets and being able to like overcome some of those like tooling challenges by solving for those more specific problems.
Yeah, I think. Wait, repeat that one more time, John.
Yeah, I mean, do you think that that is, something that folks should be addressing early on, when they're trying to go from maybe crawl to walk, being able to build more of their own tools that solve specific problems? Like, is that an inflection point? Like, tool is not specific enough.
Yeah, I think like at a certain point, you're going to come up with an idea of like an efficient usage of the cloud. And that could be anything from how do you use EC2 efficiently? Is that making sure you have the right amount of CPU or memory utilization? Are you using the right instance types? Are you modern? And then the question that I would always ask is like, how can we build that decisioning earlier on instead of like, all right, everything's running in production. Now we have a problem because people aren't doing it the way that we think is efficient or correct. Um, so where are they making those decisions and how can you either enable them to make the right decision at that point in time, or can you limit them from the decisions they can make? If you give them, you can pick any instance type you want in the world, they're probably going to pick the first one in the drop down if there's a drop down. And it was something that we saw a lot with our Databricks application. But if you were able to say, hey, there's three instance types you can use. These are the ones that are available. We know that these are all efficient ones. If you need something else, like let us know. I think like making sure that you're kind of solving for it before you get to the problem of 90% of the company is doing something in a way that we don't think is correct. So getting that as early as possible. So if you're new to your FinOps journey, kind of ask yourself some of these questions of, all right, what are all the optimization opportunities and what are ways that we can kind of have people build it correctly the first time instead of having to kind of go back in that constant loop of, oh, we found something new, go make a change. We found something new, go make a change. Like, how can you have them make that thing happen or build it correct the first time?
Yeah, and I think that's our kind of last piece that we want to talk about here too is setting some of the milestones, so that you can make that leap from crawl to walk and from walk to run. And I think that's a good one, right? Being able to say, do we have any proactive, mechanisms in place? Is that something that we're setting as a milestone and a target for us? If not, we're probably going to get stuck, only doing reactive stuff,
Yeah.
unless we're specifically, targeting, proactive pieces. And uh,
When it comes to like the automation side of that too, John, one of the questions I ask a lot of the customers that I'm working with today is that maybe they don't have specific like FinOps policies or FinOps automation in place. But I asked them the question, does your security team have automation in place? Do they already have a tool that says you can't build a public S3 bucket or you can't build an unencrypted object? Because most of the time, depending on the company, there is a lot of security tooling out there to stop people from doing things that the company has said we can't be doing. And it's a lot easier to integrate with those tools versus build your own thing from start. One from just like kind of a developer, a software developer for like creating the thing itself. But one of the hardest pieces I think with any automation is like the IAM principles and policies that you have, right? You need to have that permission on every S3 bucket at the company. Every EC2 needs to be able to allow this tool to make a change to it or do something to it. And if security already built that, or your cyber team or whoever it may be already kind of has a tool out there, how can you integrate that into building your own FinOps related policies just on a tool that was already created?
so we just look to kind of maybe other existing governance processes there and try to
Exactly.
piggyback on top of that. I think that's a good takeaway, and like, just maybe setting that as a milestone and saying we're gonna try to identify 2 or 3 new, org-wide standards that, are gonna complement something that already exists. That way, again, you're not reinventing the wheel. That's gonna be a really long road to
Yeah.
try to evaluate, new tools, try to deploy it, try to configure it, get approvals, do all the stuff. Just look to something that already exists, try to build and iterate on top of that, instead of starting from scratch.
Yeah. Like what standards are currently out there today? How are those being implemented? And then how can you inner source or build onto those tools that are already out there? Exactly.
Yeah, one thing that we heard, that was really cool from a customer was they started to share some of their roadmap, around FinOps, and it was something that came a little bit later in their maturity journey. They'd started to break it out into a couple of different pillars where, you know, we always think, first about cost optimization, and some sort of dollar savings target. I think that's something that is a good indication that, maybe you're a little bit earlier on, you're looking at visibility, scoping opportunities like you talked about.
Yeah.
But as you get a little bit more mature, maybe your roadmap, or maybe you didn't even have a roadmap, you're starting to build out the roadmap, is going to start to take into account like accountability mechanisms. How do you make sure someone actually does this? And then like the third pillar of that is, having those enablement, kind of components, which is either driving, relationships across the organization or upskilling people, having, savings days or activities like that that are happening across the organization. Um, and that's a good indication that you're moving over into those next phases because you could start to bake in governance motions and proactive stuff and all those other pieces that we called out in the other phases of the maturity journey.
Yeah. And I think the strategy itself is an interesting one because I think most companies that I've seen start off with, I want to save this much money. or I'm this much over budget. I need to reduce my budget reduce my forecast to hit my budget. And I think when you become more and more mature, it's less a dollar savings target versus an efficiency target. Like, am I using EC2 efficiently, and how am I defining that? Am I using S3 efficiently? Do I have what's my unit cost? How is that tracking over time? And then, like, the super mature customers, I think, are really looking at that unit economics at scale, and in what is the total revenue compared to our cloud costs for specific applications or the company as a whole, and kind of making their decisions based on those versus I need to save money now.
I'm curious about that. So when you talk about like unit economics, who's the audience for that? Is that the FinOps team? Is that the app teams? Is that leadership teams? What do you think that looks like as far as like a journey goes too?
Yeah, and I think yeah, that's a tough one. I think it starts probably with like the FinOps team coming up with a few different like key principles that they're tracking towards. I think then it scales to application teams. And I think it's easier to start with application teams that are maybe on like the tech side first, or like the internal tech teams. So like a Jenkins platform or a Splunk platform or something that is owned internally, because then you can really get like they know that the total cost of the platform, they know how many, if it's Jenkins, how many pipeline runs it has over a time period. I think it gets harder and harder the farther you go into the BUs that are like external and more revenue facing, because one platform might use 10 different APIs that are all owned by 10 different teams. And then how are you kind of figuring out what like the cost of that API call is that gave them a lot of information or something. So it gets tough when you have a lot of central platforms and a lot of like individual usage of those in the customer facing or the revenue facing products. It's not impossible. I definitely think it's doable, and those are the ones that senior leaders really want to see. They want to know for their investment that they just had, like, is it working? Is this new feature bringing in the money that they thought it was versus the total, I guess, cloud cost itself? But it's definitely a journey that starts with, I would usually say, the FinOps team coming up with a few key things to consider, and then kind of working your way up this stack.
Yeah, hopefully getting some feedback from folks. Like, are we hitting the mark on this? Like, is there more ways to get more data on it?
Yeah.
Um, so couple things we talked about, around things like automation, building, kind of cross-cultural, partnerships or cross-org partnerships. Some of these other areas, like being a little bit more, proactive or reaching into like code repos, doing stuff like that. Like, what are some ways that folks can like kind of start small, if they're not doing these like bigger things? This is kind of an open-ended question, but like, Dan, can you think of like some ways that folks can like sort of start small with like governance or automation? Um, Easy ways to just sort of get the ball rolling on some of those areas.
Yeah, I think from a governance perspective, like just having visualization out there for the key things that you're looking to work on. So like how much data do you have in standard versus cold storage or a non-standard tier? Um, Serverless versus non-serverless architecture. What is that as a whole? So I think there's like modernization. I think is an easy one too. Like, are you using the latest gen instance types? Are you using the preceding gen or older than that? And just having some visualization for people, and kind of making sure that they're seeing it. So like, are you sending them an email? Are they seeing it on Slack? Are they seeing it in a QBR and EBR in some sort of monthly meeting that it's being reviewed? And I think the other thing is are you talking to more than just that engineering lead that owns the application? Are you talking to their manager or their director or their EVP? Are they seeing a holistic uh, kind of grouping of the optimization opportunities and their efficiency scores at every single level? I think that's like a big one too.
How can you tell if like the right audiences are seeing that, just from your experience? Maybe you've gotten all this great data, but you don't know if it's actually landing with the right audience. Like, is there like a good like kind of gut check or litmus check that you can recommend to help making sure that that's going to the right folks?
Yeah, I mean, I think like when you start having a few meetings with different people, just asking them like, do you know what your efficiency score is? Do you know what your budget is? Do you know where you are with your budget? And kind of having just like an open conversation. Because if they say no, and then you're able to bring up the data and say, hey, you're actually like 30% efficient and you're very much over budget, they are then gonna, I would hope, change their priority for what they're doing to align to some of these. Hey, like we're over budget, we're inefficient. Like we need to prioritize optimizations to get us to a better point with our forecast than where we are today. Um,
So, that's the old, you don't know what you don't know, right? So, like, try to figure out what people don't know that they don't even know yet, right? And, go from there, and that example around, like, creating visualizations around, like, some best practices, I think that's a really cool call out too, because you had shared something with me a long time ago that, was like a great visual around, something like intelligent tiering where you're looking at, like, a time scale view, like, month over month, and you're looking at the distribution of the storage classes, and you all knew you wanted to go to intelligent tiering, so now you're looking at a view of, well, are we seeing an increase in the percentage of capacity going towards intelligent tiering? Yes or no? And then letting someone kind of see it from that lens gets them to ask those questions about, their own workload. Are we looking at this more closely? Like, we know we should be here. What do we have to do in order to get there? So I really like that call out too of kind of creating a compelling visual, going back to what you said earlier, to help sell, this idea and also make sure that you understand what good looks like as a FinOps team and how to advertise that out to folks.
Yeah, and the S3 one's an interesting one, John, because if you look at it from like a unit cost perspective, intelligent tiering, you should see your unit costs drop a ton, right? Because when it starts transitioning through the different tiers, if a lot of the data is not being used, that unit cost is going to decrease. But then you're going to hit a steady state. And then one of the things we started doing where we started finding pockets of waste within S3, and we started making like large scale deletions of data that was in AIA because we realized it wasn't being used. But the reverse effect of that is your unit cost jumps up because now you have more data in warmer tiers, so more expensive tiers. So you kind of like, depending on how you look at it, someone can say, "Oh, well, our unit cost is now more expensive." We're like, "Well, we just deleted X petabytes of data in a cold tier that was never being used." So that this is actually a good thing. And being able to explain that and visual, and again, show that graph of like, all right, well, this is how much data we had in these tiers. We saw the transition. We saw the unit cost go down. We then whacked a bunch of this stuff in the the AIA because it wasn't being used, and we saw that unit costs spike up. All right, what's the next kind of thing we want to focus on?
And I'm thinking about like a recap for everything you've kind of shared with us here, Dan. I'm gonna kind of take a swag at going through this, but a couple of things that I heard, and let me know if I missed anything, was look for some of those existing tools and processes that are already there that you could piggyback on top of to elevate the maturity of the FinOps team, right? So, are you already doing that with security or governance someplace else? Piggyback on top of that and try to ride those processes. Try to identify specific problems to solve so that you can unpack all these different dimensions that, maybe, around technical considerations or how do you scale that out? How do you implement the governance or automation around it? But pick a specific problem so you can get really, really detailed on it and also identify like the skill sets that maybe are missing.
Yeah.
The call out around like help to people to validate, that they don't know what they don't know, find those gaps so that they can get more educated around it. Look at building the partnerships early on with different folks within the organization, especially those that maybe have some complementary offerings. And last one I have here is around, investing in the technical skills. So growing those by either adding additional headcount or, helping people to, up level themselves based on, kind of key areas. So those are kind of 5 different ones I call out. Did I miss anything there, or you think we kind of captured it pretty well?
I think the last one is like ask for help if you need it. And it could be your account team, it could be asking for a specialist, or just someone at your company that might be that's me for that thing you're trying to do. Um, Most of the time, there's someone that knows that service for that thing better than you do itself, and I found that out a lot in my career. And as long as you're bringing the right people, like you said earlier, like you're doing all of the needful things that you need to do to kind of make a change.
And we got about 2 minutes left here. I'm curious, what do you think is the most underrated skill for FinOps folks, to develop?
That's a good one. I think it's probably storytelling and being able to convince whether it's someone like that's a developer why they should do it, but also being able to convince someone that's in maybe the C-suite or in a senior leadership role why they need to prioritize this thing that you're recommending. And it could be just a recommendation like a savings plan. Like, why is this savings plan? Why should we spend all this money on a 3-year commitment all up front versus something else? So being able to kind of tell the story and then back up your story with data. If you're not backing up the story with data, they're probably not going to believe you, and it's going to be a hard time. So like making sure you have all of the data and everything there to kind of convince and kind of sell your optimization or your positive thing you're trying to do for the company.
So you use actual, data facts to back it up, not, just pure persuasion,
Analysis will save you money if you do it.
Yeah.
That way it might be a hard sell.
Yeah. That's awesome. This is really insightful, Dan, and I think we unpacked like a lot of great detail around like what the journey actually looks like. Um, so really appreciate you taking the time to go through all this with us. Want to share for the audience here. Steph's going to be back next week, and excited to kind of hear from everyone about everything that they learned, at FinOps X and how all that went down in San Diego this past week. A lot of really cool, customer stories that came out, new announcements, and a lot to kind of unpack there. But thank you again, Dan, for joining us today and kind of walking through and, sharing all of your experience with the audience.
Yeah, thanks, John. Thanks for having me. Looking forward to doing another one of these too.
Absolutely. All right. We'll see
Thank
everyone next week.
you.